Now, to start the discussion of the Treasury, I want to start by looking at their FY14 IT budget, which is requested at a level of $3.75 billion. Just as a reminder, we have been talking about FY14 numbers throughout the presentation here, but again, we're operating under a continuing resolution, so it's not really that simple. Now, Treasury was not one of the agencies to receive a new appropriation last year, and that basically means that they're dealing with FY12 numbers with a few minor adjustments due to inflation. There was a slight spending increase in the FY13 CR. And one thing to point out here, though, is the Treasury has a lot of flexibility, a lot more flexibility than most when it comes to repurposing or otherwise reprogramming money. And that means they have more options than some of their non-defense counterparts under a CR. And as an aside, we're hearing that they're really using that to prioritize Affordable Care Act spending. I also want to point out the sub-agency chart on the right and draw everyone's attention to what I think is pretty obvious. IRS is by far the largest Treasury Bureau here. As a matter of fact, if you broke them out on their own, they would still be one of the 5 highest funded civilian agencies from an IT budget standpoint. Outside of IRS, the majority of Treasury spending is going to go through the Bureau of the Fiscal Service, which is a fairly recent body composed of the Bureau of Public Debt, or BPD, and the Financial Management Service, or FMS. Now, the department is divided similarly to HHS in that you've got a set of offices that operate at the headquarters level and a set of bureaus that carry out differing mission areas here. The departmental CIO resides under the Undersecretary of Management, which is highlighted in green. Robin East heads that group, and those of you with ICAM technologies in particular are going to want to seek her out and ask about the TCAM program. That's TEICAM, which is Treasury's HSPD 12 investment. Now, in terms of bureaus to focus on, I already mentioned the IRS, but there are a few sort of smaller potential insertion points for vendors here. Aside from the Bureau of the Fiscal Service, there's also the Comptroller of the Currency, or OCC, the U.S. Mint, and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Center, or FinCEN. Now, that last one is pretty interesting because despite having a fairly small budget, their mission area of criminal detection and law enforcement gives them some pretty cutting-edge requirements. And so that could be an opportunity for some of those cutting-edge data analytics or law enforcement capabilities to play.
And moving our focus onto the bureaus, obviously the IRS is what we're going to be talking about. If you look at the structure of the bureau, there are really 3 major IT insertion points that you have. You've got the Office of the Chief Financial Officer, the Office of the Chief Technology Officer, and agency-wide shared services. Now, Danny Werfel is currently the acting commissioner, and John Koskinen, he's the president's nominee to take over the IRS. He's currently awaiting Senate confirmation. The other name to note here is Terry Milholland, who's IRS's Chief Technology Officer. Now, that title actually means a little bit of something different here than it means in a lot of other federal agencies. The Chief Technology Officer here is essentially the Bureau's Chief Information Officer.
And this is what his office looks like. You may also have heard this group referred to as Modernized Information Technology Services, or MITS. Now, the IRS has a lot of autonomy in its IT purchasing and architecture, and so this group has a pretty influential role to play in terms of policy and regulatory affairs, just like at HQ. But unlike headquarters, IRS OCTO manages a program portfolio worth over $2 billion. And so there are a lot of purchasing decisions that are being made directly out of this office. I'm not going to get into what each of the individual functions do here, and most of them, frankly, are fairly self-explanatory, but I do want to point out enterprise services, which is responsible for things like enterprise architecture, configuration management, lifecycle management, some dashboarding and reporting functions for OCTO. And before we move on, I do want to mention quickly that we are hearing some rumors about a potentially pretty major reorg of this office. There's no clear picture of what that's going to look like when it shakes out, but having served in this position for a very long time, it looks like Terry Milholland may be stepping down, and the structures and responsibilities of the offices here may shift around quite a bit as well. So that's just something to be aware of and keep an eye out for as we move forward into the fiscal year.
So moving on to the major contract vehicles within Treasury, outside of the standard vehicles for IT product procurement, there are a few Treasury-specific contracts that you should be aware of. One of them is Prime, and that was awarded to CSC way back in 1998 to support IRS systems modernization. Now, this contract is winding down, which is why we don't see it represented up here on this slide. And while there may be some more limited recompetition of some of the administrative aspects of Prime, we don't actually expect to see the entire contract be recompeted. The reason for that, of course, is the rise of the Total Information Processing Support Services, or TIPS contracts. Currently, we're on the 4th iteration of TIPS. Although the scope of that contract does not explicitly allow for the purchase of COTS products, there's language that allow TIPS vendors to issue task orders to actually get the products that they need as a part of building these systems and modernizing IRS systems. So in other words, if you are not on a TIPS team, getting on one is definitely going to make your path into the department much, much easier.
I want to quickly take a look at some of the factors that are driving IT procurement across the Treasury. And what jumps out here is, given its mission, the department is handling just huge quantities of data on a day-to-day basis. And so improved data management, warehousing, data quality, analytics capabilities are always in demand here. Now, in terms of data center consolidation, the Treasury has a pretty aggressive schedule as civilian government agencies go, with a plan to virtualize 50% of their Windows servers by the end of FY14. Shared services are also a focus here, both because they're a cost-saving measure and because BPD's Administrative Resource Center is actually a GSA-designated shared service provider for the financial management and HR management lines of business. And finally, cybersecurity is always a concern here. The particular focus at Treasury is configuration management, continuous monitoring, and ICAM tools. And before we move on, a couple of IRS-specific drivers. The first bullet up here, we've already talked about it, should be familiar to everybody, but IRS does have a very big role in the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. Now, the income verification requirements there were delayed. They have since been reinstated as part of the continuing resolution, and so development activities are continuing around the systems to support that. Now, the Business System Modernization Initiative covers a number of programs, including CADE 2 and modernized efile, and we'll discuss both of those a little bit later. The development work on both ACA and BSM is being done by TIPS contractors. It really reinforces the importance of that contract. Companies like Deloitte and SAIC have both received large task order awards. And now moving into some Treasury programs, the first I want to talk about is CADE 2. This is an overhaul of the database and the back-end systems that support all of IRS's tax processing activities. This is eventually going to be the system of record here. So if you file your taxes in the next few years, that information is going to run through CADE 2. So really the requirements here are data management and analytics, as well as data integration, business intelligence, and really all the other big data related tools you can think of. Starting in FY14, IRS is specifically requesting funds to design and develop applications to expand CADE 2's relational database, and so there's also an application development play here.
So modernized efile is the second major aspect of the business systems modernization, and it speaks directly to IRS's strategic goal of improving its web services. So according to the Inspector General, modernized efile is not yet robust enough to allow IRS to completely retire its legacy efile system. However, MEF has been in place since the 2012 filing season, so if any of you filed your returns online, and we certainly hope that you all filed your returns whichever way, but that you probably did it through this system. Modernized efile is only allowing users to so far file 1040s, so recent development work has actually focused on expanding that system's capability to handle more tax forms and returns. So those activities are going to continue, and you're also going to find specific requirements around performance testing platform and performance monitoring here with this program.
Next up is the Return Review Program, or RRP. It's replacing the legacy electronic fraud detection system, and as that name suggests, this is intended to be IRS's major system in place to detect return fraud and cut down on improper refund payments. The program is pure DME, so it has not yet been deployed, and it's also been hampered by some pretty major cost and schedule overruns. The scheduled deployment timeline here was for Transition State 1, which is basically an initial operating capability, to have been rolled out by January of this year, with development on Transition State 2 beginning in FY14. That didn't happen so much. A recent IRS IG report slammed this program, saying that it was, quote, at extreme risk of missing its final deployment deadline of January 2015. Things are not going too well. So the requirements here are mostly running in application development. But this is also, again, a huge big data play. So technologies in particular that deal with fraud, waste, and abuse detection are going to find an audience at RRP.